Happy? Okay, perfect. Okay, please take a seat, ladies and gentlemen. Right, well, thank you again to Silver for being the most organized man in the world who decided in 24 hours to get this sorted for us. So, anyway, welcome.
Hey, great to be here.
Yeah, very good. As you can see, Matt only has one type of T-shirt, which actually is a funny story because you did nearly start a white T-shirt company, did you not?
Yeah, this is true, but it transpired that was a bad idea, so I didn't do that.
So you just decided to run with the branding and leave the company till later, yeah.
Yeah, precisely. I'm waiting for someone else to do that and lose a load of money, and I can buy the great white T-shirts.
So you have got quite, well, first of all, thanks for coming. You've got quite an interesting background. I kind of touched a bit on it with the team, but how does that, tell us a bit about it. How did you find yourself from being a consultant at McKinsey to now being an angel investor and multiple-time entrepreneur? Why did you make the shift?
I don't really think there was a shift. First off, now I build companies. That's the number one thing. Like I angel invest because it's fun and interesting, but that's a hobby. Building is the most fun thing. So everyone here is quite lucky to be able to do that. But I've always built stuff. So I did stuff when I was at like primary school, and then Ross and I actually first met when we were at secondary school together, and I had a business there.
He employed me as a waiter.
Yeah, never again. So I've always built stuff and always wanted to build things, and I always knew that I just love solving problems and I love building businesses. But luckily, I was just about smart enough in my teens. I was really fortunate to get an offer to go to Oxford University, and I thought, okay, I'll probably be an idiot to turn that down, so I'll go and do that, and then I'll start another business. And then I got an offer to go and work at McKinsey, and again, I thought, you know what, I'll do that, and then I'll go and start a business. But like that was it. After 5 years of prevarication, there was nothing that was going to stop me going and starting a company.
And what was the inflection point? What kicked you out of a very cushy job to actually take the leap?
Again, I met one of my co-founders, Hiroki, in the kind of training week before joining McKinsey, and the first conversation we had was, the day we leave here, we're starting a company, and you know we have to be here 18 to 24 months, so that day is probably going to be in 18 months' time. And we had an amazing experience, learned a ton, it's a fantastic company, and it gave me a skill set, a work ethic, all those things, but it really gave us like 18 months of being able to think about what we were going to do next. So there was no like change, I'd always built stuff, always wanted to build stuff, and that was a good moment of preparation.
And there were three of you. So you, Hiroki, and then Tom, the Monzo founder. How did you guys get together initially to tee things off?
So there was actually three, there was a different third person when we originally worked together and started thinking about building something. And then one day I pointed out that we had like 3 consultants, which is the worst possible founding team for anything because no one can actually do anything. So I just said, look, maybe it's me, I have to step away, but I think 3 like non-technical co-founders is a very bad idea. And it ended up being myself and Hiroki, but that meant like two jobs immediately like came up that we had to do. Number 1 was we had to learn to build something ourselves. So we went and started learning to code, and Hiroki was much better at that than me. And then second, we had to go and find someone who, you know, had a technical background who could help us build this thing. And that's how we got intro to Tom via our network.
And from there, you guys then flowed into YC and things. So what was I think YC would be a really interesting thing to maybe circle on a bit, because one of the big challenges we have is maintaining, or at least continuing to innovate and find whole new product market fits, right? And they're quite hardcore on their approach for doing that early stage, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think just ludicrously focused. So we did that back in summer 2011, and it was, you know, we thought it was a big thing then. They just stepped up to kind of, I think it was like 50 or 60 companies a batch, and then the last batch they just had, it was like 400 companies a batch. So it's changed a lot over the past decade. But what they really were was the first place that I think that created a model for building tech startups. And they said, hey, like, let's really strip it back to what it takes to be successful when you're building anything. And really, they figured out it was 2 things, right? And in fact, one, but there were 2 components to that. Like the whole ethos was make something people want, which seems obvious, but it's actually incredibly hard, especially when you get distracted by all the other stuff around the fringes. And then the 2 components of that were basically, you know, talk to your users and build product. And I actually think that you can say like they care about it a lot, think about it a lot, but it all comes down to that. And I think that's really key, whether you're building a startup from scratch or whether you're building new products in a startup. Like if you're if you're making things that people want, you're probably going to be successful. And to do that, you need to talk to your users and then build stuff.
And then when you then broke off and started Nested, you had to go through that process basically with all of this learning in the bank, right? I remember that was when we talked about the T-shirt company and various different things. It would be really helpful to unpack a bit how you went from, okay, I'm leaving Gocardless, I want to start something, to raising, this is the thing I'm going to go with. What did that discovery process look like?
So I knew I wanted to found something. I went away and kind of thought about it, and I think it's important to be kind of humble and consider everything. So it was like, okay, I'll go and talk to people about, I could start something, I could join something, I could go and learn something completely new. And I kind of knew deep down that I wanted to build something. And I think that's really important. You've got like the analytical side of, okay, what should I do? And then the like deep in your stomach side of like, I want to do this thing. And sometimes you've just got to listen. And I think it's the same with thinking about like the ideas themselves. You go away and you do all the analysis and you consider, do I think this is a good or bad idea? And then that kind of feeds into your gut, which is like, okay, do I want to build this company or not? Especially when you realize like building something is hard and takes time. And as much as I told people I knew that 10 years ago when we first founded Gocardless, I really didn't. I did not appreciate how hard it is to build big companies. We're 11 years on, I'm still on the board there, and we've still like all to play for. We've still got so much left in that journey and so many things to do, and that's 11 years on. I think a couple of decades ago, it used to be like average time to IPO was 4 or 5 years. It's now, more like 10 to 13 years, and that's a long old journey. There's a lot of stuff to be done, and equally, it's a really hard path. Like, look at some stats recently, and I think it's from some YC stats, it's only 5% of their companies that they've backed over the past 15 years have gone on to be worth like more than $100 million, and it's just over 1% that have gone on to be worth more than $1 billion. And yet everyone that starts a company talks about how they're going to be the next $1 billion company and they're going to do this stuff. So I think it's a tougher path than people realize. And then rewinding back to your original question of like, how did you think about stuff? How did you pick? I think you can't just be in the game for the outcome. If you're just there to build, $1 billion company, then there's a 99% probability you're going to end up disappointed, sadly. So there has to be more to it. And for me, it was like, okay, I want to be in a space, like everything for me comes down to fun, learning, impact. So it was like, okay, I want to be working with a team that I love working with, where I go in every day and it's just a joy. I want to build the kind of company that I want to work at. And then on learning, it's like, hey, if I spent 5, even 10 years working on this company and ultimately have failed because they do, it would still be a valuable use of my time because I would have learned about something that I find so interesting and fascinating, that's useful. In fact, funny enough, I was going through Gergely's blog and he was talking about something the other day. One of your blog posts was about like, was something a sunk cost or was that an investment for the future? And I think that's a really good example. If you're doing things you love, then it's never a sunk cost. It's always an investment for the future. And then impact, doing something where I actually think, if we can have a difference, then it will be worth something.
And do you think, because you said those stats around success and the time to IPO, how much of that is harder, do you think, by being in Europe, and how much of that is changing? Have you seen in the last 10 years?
So yeah, there's a few like counteracting forces.
Well, outside of Europe, if you're in the UK.
Yeah, so no, I can. That hurts. So no, it's the world has changed so much from even like 10 years ago when we started. When we started, like the term unicorn didn't even exist, and to be worth a billion, like there was probably, I don't know the number, but it was very few companies worth more than $1 billion worldwide. Not even then. Like they were just like, and even then, you look back at Skyscanner sold for like $1.5 billion like 5 years ago. What would they be worth today? Like current multiples. Like it's just a completely different world. So the biggest change over the past however many years has been that private companies in particular, and you see this in the public markets too, are just can be a lot bigger than they used to be. And partly that's because there's kind of nowhere else for money to go. But that's one of the biggest things. And the second big change, I think, is a lot of money finding its way, because it's a really benign interest rate environment. There's nowhere for people to make any money. A lot of money is finding its way back towards early stage investment. So it used to be, okay, you used to IPO in 4 or 5 years, and then companies were like, okay, IPOing is a real pain in the arse and brings a lot of reporting requirements. We'd really rather not have to do that. And investors said, well, hey, we'll fund you privately instead. So all this capital that used to go into IPOs came into late stage private companies. And then people realized like, oh, wow, these companies can get really, really big and we can make massive returns. We're going to start coming back earlier and earlier until recently. And we've now seen it kind of Series A investors coming back and saying, right, we're just going to kind of index all the top funds investments. And because there's going to be a couple of outliers, we can make a ton of money. So the biggest differences, I think, are one, in the current markets, we seem to be able to create really, really big companies and people are realizing like quite how big these companies can be. And then number two, the like flood of capital available for those companies, which permits them to go and build and be a lot bigger. I mean, in fact, there's one other difference that I think is really important, which has changed, which is, and this is kind of a change for the worse, maybe better soon, is with the kind of SaaS came out of nowhere as basically the best business model anyone had ever invented, like 20 years ago. It's just amazing, right? You build this piece of software once, you sell it millions and millions of times. And nobody understood it at first. These VCs started throwing money at SaaS companies and saying, hey, it's growth at all costs. And people are like, this is crazy. Why are you giving these people this money? Like, why are they buying these customers? But when you're buying a customer and they repay their value within 6 to 12 months and they have a lifetime of, 5, 10 years, it's an absolute no-brainer to grow at all costs. So this thing sprung out and suddenly like it became the norm to give loads of money to startups, grow really fast, growth at all costs. And then over the past kind of 10 years or so, we saw that expand out from like SaaS startups to all startups. And you saw people like Gerge was at Uber. We saw it with WeWork, where these companies don't have those short payback costs. They don't have these amazing margins. And suddenly they're doing growth at all costs, but on a completely different model. And I think over the past couple of years, like that's kind of shaken out. And we're starting to realize like, okay, growth at all costs in startups makes sense in some places. But in others, you have to focus on, you talked about it in the presentation here, like we actually have to nail our unit economics. And I think that's been a kind of challenging thing for a lot of companies to get through, but a really healthy step forward for the ecosystem.
And what were the inflection points? What were the big triggers you think changed that shift in mindset? Were there a few big things that happened that have recalibrated people, or is it just natural that as the ecosystem gets more mature, people work it out?
I think that there's always these moments, but that people point to in hindsight, but I'm not convinced that I suspect they're more effect than cause. So lots of people would point at like Adam Newman's Travaise over the past couple of years at WeWork as a really good example of like, okay, maybe this model doesn't work. But I think that is actually just an effect where people kind of realize long before the IPO, okay, this thing doesn't make sense. And, maybe we're going to go to town on this guy a little bit for some of his antics.
So if you were to give advice to people who maybe aren't as deep in the VC angel world as you, who are trying to assess and identify characteristics of startups and companies that they're either a part of or they might want to join, what are the simple triggers and simple high-level elements that you think are critical when evaluating a job or looking at,
Yeah, number one is always people. People, kind of everything follows from people. People create the environment. They affect your day-to-day existence. Is it going to be fun? Am I going to learn? Am I going to have an impact? Like the biggest lever on that will be the people you work with. So, yeah, and I don't think that's changed ever. So if anybody tells you otherwise, I think they're probably wrong. And then the second thing is if you're looking for growth, then you kind of want to go through that in a company. You can be at a company for a few years and kind of experience this like a curve that goes like that, and you get this area under the curve. Means something like that goes like that, and you get a much bigger area under the curve. Or you can be at like Zenefits, where it's like up and down, and you get that area under the curve like multiple times. So I think you want to be somewhere where you can sense that there's going to be a journey. And then the last thing is, if I was actually trying to pick a company, and I've got beyond, okay, I've got two companies, they've got great people, it's a great environment, I can learn, I can develop, I want to pick something that's going to be, the right financial choice for me. Then I would always look, and I'll talk about this later in the other session, like companies are only as valuable as the cash flows they create. And therefore I'd look at, okay, what kind of cash flows can this company create and how valuable are they? And there's only a couple of ways that they can really be valuable. Like when you're figuring out how valuable a company's cash flows are, you're especially in startups, you're talking a lot about the future and where they're going to go, and you're basically doing a net present value model on those. And there's two ways they get really big. One is it can grow really fast. So you're looking at it and like, okay, we're on a very, very steep curve, and I can see that continue because there's a big TAM. Like, that's check one or way one. That's really risky because it's tough, and so few people manage to like sustain that curve for long enough. And then the second way, the way that I love, is if they're really durable. So Gocardless, some of our earliest cohorts from 10 years ago, still are getting bigger today. Like we've still got net negative churn on those. If every time you layer on like a cohort of revenue, it's still there in 10 years' time, great. If it's even still getting bigger in 10 years' time, that's amazing because you start stacking these cohorts on top and it becomes really valuable.
Which thankfully are both warmly present at Travelperk.
But yeah, so like I'd look at, can they create valuable cash flows? And the two ways to do that is one, it can grow really fast, and two, it's extremely retentive or they're really durable revenues.
So just that's super. Stepping back off that a bit, like what do you think are the big areas right now that people aren't working in yet that you would love to see interesting new startups emerge? Or like the big trends, because I mean, a lot of VCs have, you know, very established topics that they're looking at. What are the ones you think people aren't looking at that will be big?
If I knew that, I think I'd be a lot smarter than I am. So I'd actually simplify it. I think when you innovate, so this took me ages to realize, and I didn't do it courtesy of myself. Steve Blank wrote some really interesting stuff. And he like noted that there's only like a few ways that you can actually innovate. And I thought, no, there's millions of ways you can innovate. There's millions of businesses you can come up with, and actually categorize that there's only 4. Which sounds terrible, but actually is great. So it's like basically you can do the same thing, but cheaper. You can do the same thing, but segment it for a new market. So for example, yeah, or you can go and do, do that thing better. So we just go head to head. Or number 4, you go and do something you couldn't do before. And like those are the only 4 ways you can innovate. And I think like in each of those buckets, you can just see the next generation of companies coming when you apply that lens to any industry. And I think people, including myself in the past, have over-intellectualized and tried to say like, oh wow, imagine if you could do A, B, C, D. And it's actually like, well, back to that theme earlier of make something people want. If something happens today, like that's probably a very good indication that people are going to want to do that or something like that moving forwards. And then I think the simple lens on it is like, okay, well, how do we do that? How do we do that like, but better? How do we do that but segment for a different audience? So there used to be a CRM for every vertical. How do we make a CRM specific for this vertical? So better, specialized, cheaper, or something completely different. And that something completely different bucket is where like probably the majority of companies start, and also the majority of companies fail because it's way more difficult because it doesn't have established proof. So for me, I'd be thinking about those and then laying on the lenses of like, okay, not let's just do ML for X or AI for X or whatever, but let's start with the problem, let's start with what people are doing today, and then let's look at the new technologies that are coming out and say, okay, how does that actually make this thing better? How does it add up to one of those types of innovation?
That's, that's awesome. I think just changing gear a little bit, one thing that you guys were and you in particular have got a very good reputation at Gocardless for having done is building a very good team. When you build teams, when you interview, when you hire, you must have done thousands by now. What's your simple mental model for sitting down with anybody and working out if they're a great hire or not? This is something everybody in this room is doing right now. How would you simplify it into the easy blocks?
Yeah, again, these are great questions that I wish I had fantastic answers to. Hiring's really tough, and we're all pretty terrible at it. I remember, when I did this at Gocardless, I did it at Nested, like I go back through all my hires and I think, I'm same as everyone like thinks you're an above average driver. I'm like, I think I'm pretty good hire. I'm a pretty good interviewer. And I went back through my record, the number of like stellar hires I've made, the number of like, okay hires and the number of not so good hires. And the latter bucket was far higher than I'd like it to be. So the first point I think is I'm sat here like definitely not professing to have this nailed down. But my few tips that I think all do apply. Number 1 is like actually. So number 1 is number 1 and 2 are kind of a bit paradoxical, but number 1 is actually spend some time on the JD in the first place. Like really think about the kind of the psychology of like what you're looking to do, like who you actually hire, like what they're going to take to be successful. And don't over obsess about, okay, they have to have worked at company A, B, C, D, E, but like really think about what's the kind of person that we're trying to hire here. And I think 1, that's way more diverse, but 2, like the more time you spend there, when you write this ad, it will speak to people. And if you're like, okay, what we need is someone who is really proactive, then let's write to that psychology. Whereas if we need someone really organized, like let's write to that. And one thing I don't think you could accuse me of is when I write a JD, like I have people that apply and they were like, oh, yeah, it was really obvious to me that you really cared about this thing because you repeated it like 4 times in the space of a JD that was 3 paragraphs. But they're like, but that meant I knew it was for me. So I think that's number one. And like you can save yourself a lot of effort almost by letting the other party self-select in to what's going on. Number 2, you're scaling, so you're going to go through this. Everybody assumes that you write a JD, you put it live, job done, candidates are going to come flooding in. And actually, I think that's like the biggest mistake anybody makes. And your challenge is then you're restricted only to inbound candidates when there should be like, inbound, there should be effectively like outbound sourced referrals and a ton of other channels. And if you're restricted to 1/10 of the candidates, then kind of rubbish in, rubbish out, you're not going to get the best hires. So actually, you should be spending at tops 20% of your time on hiring, on prepping the JD, doing the interviews, running the process. 80% of your time should be on filling the top of the funnel and getting great candidates in. Because again, if you get great candidates in, it's way easier to assess them through the process because you have these stellar people who just jump out at you. So that's like probably the biggest error that anybody makes. And then number 3 that I think is useful, I have a really simple mental model when I'm hiring, which is basically skill, will, fit, right? And I just go through those things. And the number one thing for me is like will or attitude. Like if somebody's got the will and the attitude to be successful, then I'm willing to give them everything to help them be successful. And then you've got skill. In fact, I have one other bucket: skill, will, directly relevant experience, and fit. And like those 4 things, I just try and think about for every hire, like do they have those things and know which ones I need a hygiene level for and which ones I need you to shine on.
And some of the conversations we've had, you have made some more tactical suggestions of things that you do, right? Where I remember at one point you were saying it's impossible for you to ever have a wasted interview because there's always some value you can extract, or the way in which at the end of the process you maybe go back and review written comms. There's a lot of little things that you seem to have baked into your process that maybe you're not intuitively saying, but to me, you seem to have a system.
Oh yeah, for sure. I just think everything's a signal. Everything's a signal, both on you and on them. So I'm constantly thoughtful about the signal that I want us to be sending out as a company, and also like trying to be open-minded and aware of the signals that they're sending me. So yeah, my favorite, actually, the most important bits of the process for me, when we've run a whole process, there's 2. If anybody ever applies to a company that I'm working at, like you could game it. Number 1 is we ask a question at the beginning of the process, which is like, it's worded carefully, but it's basically like what it roughly equates to what made you apply. But it's written in such a way that you get people who just respond like, I saw your ad on LinkedIn. And then you get people who respond with an essay being like, I've been following this company for 3 years. I love what you're doing. I'm excited by the space. And there's just worlds of difference between those 2 people that they've kind of, allowed you to see really quickly. And I've had people who've gone right through the process, and we've got 2 candidates at the end, and I've gone back through it and seen those answers, and like that's all I needed. For the whole process, like that one question would have been enough for me to make that decision. And then the second thing I do that I don't know anybody else who really does this. I'm like really like a pain, but I go back through all the comms with the recruiter, because people show their like often like with me or with whoever, or when you're in an interview, you're on your like best behavior. When you're sending like an email responding to the recruiter, like scheduling a time for an interview, you're not necessarily on your best behavior. And I go back through all those emails and I just see like, okay, how responsive were these people? How polite were these people? Like, when they didn't think anyone was watching. And like, that's always an amazing signal where you can see like, okay, this person, like when they came to the interview, they were really switched on and seemed like they really wanted it. But then every time they took 3 days to respond, they were really rude to the person. Like, this just isn't someone who's going to be a fit for us.
And a lot of companies try weird interview tactics, right? Like strangely, the whole, how many tennis balls in a stadium. So what are the things you've tried that completely failed, that you would just remove from your flow and you recommend you don't touch?
I don't think I've tried to like over intellectualize. So whenever anyone asks you for like a failure, you feel like you really need to put one forward, or you seem arrogant. Like, I've got plenty of failure. I just, what have I done? I've definitely like challenged people too much. I think sometimes when you're trying to be like a tough interviewer and you go and give people all these hard questions, and I think you can just come across a bit of a dick. So that wouldn't be a tip. And I also think that people people will open up and often give you a lot more when, when you're not challenging them and getting in their grill. So maybe there are certain roles where you need to see that someone can handle stuff under pressure and like that's worthwhile. But generally, yeah, don't do that. And then maybe that other one, this one I still just haven't figured out. Or in fact, I've got a solution, but it's just inefficient. I really find it hard to hire for especially marketing roles, because anyone who's like a vaguely competent marketer can sound very good in an interview. So it's really difficult. Like they're one of those roles. It's just hard to tell. Like, is this person like talking a good game, or can they actually deliver? And the only way I can split on that is we get people in at the final round and give them a task and just say, hey, and we pay them for their time. Say, look, come in for half a day, work on this thing with the team. And again, you have these people who've seemed brilliant through the process, and then and it only has to be something really simple, like write a blog post, and you just see worlds of difference in their ability. So maybe my last tip is actually like, don't presume that you're so brilliant that you can figure something out that in 30 minutes that you just can't. My last tip, actually, this is screwed up. I didn't do references for like the first couple of years, which I think is really arrogant, where you're like, okay, in 30 minutes, I can figure out this person better than someone that worked with them for like 3 years, because I'm just that smart, and I'm not. So quickly I learned that that's a really important thing to do and do properly, and if you ask questions correctly, you can get so much signal out of that.
So my final question before we'll flip over to Q&A from the team. So have a little think about if you want to ask something, and we'll come to you in a second. You have built great hiring brands. People want to work for the companies that you've started. Why?
I think, again, it goes back to the point I made earlier of just people. If you're lucky enough to hire some really good people, that perpetuates. And then it's like, okay, well, how do you get the people? I think it's the environment you create. In fact, look, I have a really simple philosophy. I think a better answer to this is a tangential one, which is like my philosophy on building companies, which is a great company does not come from the mind of one person. As fantastic as Avi or Ross or whoever is, like, you can't do it alone. This thing takes 15 years and many great people. So job number one when you start a company becomes like, okay, how do I get lots of great people to come together and work together? And to do that, you have to give them respect and autonomy and a good environment and all those things. And then assuming that you can do that, your new challenge becomes, okay, I've got loads of great, smart, ambitious people like in the same place. My new risk is that they all start running off over here, especially when you've got people like Ross. So then it's like, okay, well, what's the glue that holds all these people together? How do we get them pointing in the same direction? And that glue is basically having a really clear strategies, like a somewhat meaningful mission, and then most important of all, like values and culture that people believe in and buy in and create an environment where they want to be in every day. But so number one is, can you get great people? Because everything stems from that. And then number two is, if you can back that up with those other things, you give people what they need to sustain that. But I think autonomy is really key. I think strong values is key. And I think clear direction and, is really pivotal.
Thank you. That was awesome. So I'm going to hand over now, and for the bold among you, let's see if we have any questions. So if you put your hand up, I'll bring the mic over and you can ask Matt directly.
One, two. So what would be your advice on finding co-founders to start something with you? And, what criteria would you use when, meeting them? And where would you find them?
Yeah, you guys are bringing out all the easy questions. So my criteria is really simple. Again, I think like the simpler things are, the easier they are to do, like trust and respect. Fundamentally, like, do I like this person? I'm going to be spending an awful lot of time with them for the next, 10 to 15 years if we're successful. I need to like them. Number two, do I trust them? Like when the chips are down and they could walk away and screw me and do whatever, like, do I trust them to stick around or do the right thing? And it's in companies, what everybody misses is no matter how successful you are, every company faces an existential event basically every year of its existence. And they're just lucky if they realize it and do something about it. And that's, that's why companies always die, like even when they're really big and successful. And therefore, it's really important you can trust someone, because those low moments are going to come and you need them to stick around. And then respect. Like if I'm going to build a company, I want to build a good company, and building a good company, you need good people. So it needs to be someone who I believe in. So like, trust, and respect. And it's 3 out of 3. It's not like 2 out of 3. We'll take a risk. We'll see what happens. Maybe we'll learn to like each other. It's 3 out of 3. And then finding those people, yesterday is when I'd like to find them. It's something that I think takes time. You can't like, trust, and respect someone overnight. So I think you need to invest time in it. And that, for me, means exposing yourself to the kind of people that have similar ambitions, so want to go and build the same kinds of companies as you. So for instance, if I want to start a tech startup, then it's people who want to build a technology startup and scale it, versus equally great is someone who wants to go and build a lifestyle business, but you need consistency amongst those things. And then the other point I kind of missed, because it's an obvious one, is like complementary skill set. So if I'm great at product, then I probably want someone who's a bit stronger at GTM, or if I'm great at strategy, like vice versa. So I think it's worth thinking about those things, but like, trust, respect, ideally build a long-term relationship to make this thing happen. And third, that only comes through, I think, probably like shared experience. So being a place like this where there's a ton of ambitious, smart, driven builders is a great place to do it. Or, or university, which obviously I'm too old for now, sadly, and other places like that.
Okay. After this, if you just raise your hand, then I'll come to you while Matt's answering. So.
Hi. I was really interested I think it's called the Dunning Kruger effect, about how everyone thinks they're above average. The original research for that was done on people who were in hospital because of car accidents that they were the cause of. So, with the hiring, you went back and saw these were the good hires, these were the average hires, these were the poor hires. But did you consider your hiring misses as well? Did you look through and say, this guy, we should have hired him?
Yeah, not in as fully scientific way. In fact, we go back the Dunning Kruger thing. Yeah, I think somewhere I knew that. I always find the Dunning Kruger curve really interesting. I don't know who's seen it, but it basically is a curve that says, over time, as you acquire very little knowledge of something, you quickly believe you're an expert. And then as you acquire more knowledge of it, you quickly realize that you're a fucking idiot. And then eventually, years later, like the curve gets back up to where you thought you were after about 2 months. And I'm constantly doing things and trying to figure out where the hell I am on that curve. I'm like, okay, I think I'm really good at this thing. And it's like, am I on that slope or that slope? And generally, sadly, it's this slope over here. And then back to your question, I tried to, and there's so many misses. And there's something that I've learned about kind of people and talent over the past decade that I definitely didn't realize when I started out at this, which is I think everyone has a very clear bias over what talent looks like. And often that bias is based on the kind of talent they are. So if you're an ex-consultant who's very analytical and smart and driven and hardworking, you think that that's what a great person looks like, partly because that fits with your mental model of like what makes you great, partly because the path you've been on, that probably is what was great. And through building companies over however long, I've learned that, hey, just because you're not successful in this environment, that doesn't mean you're not going to be successful in another environment. Like context is really king here. And I've learned that building my own companies and seeing people where they didn't quite work out and then they went and did something amazing elsewhere. And I've also learned that through angel investing, where I've seen people look and say, oh no, that guy doesn't know what the hell he's doing, or blah, blah, blah. And you see that it just takes all different people to build all sorts of different companies. There are some amazing product founders that people are looking like, oh no, they're not driven enough, they're not enough of an animal. And then the guy goes and builds Hopin, he's phenomenal. And the same with so many other companies, like different people build different companies, and it really takes all sorts. And therefore I made loads of misses. And I think probably my biggest miss early on when I look back was me being kind of biased and a bit myopic about what talent looked like.
I have a question for you. We passed over the mic. I'm here talking to you. I had a similar kind of UK cookie cutter approach that they kind of push you through, right? It's like go to university, graduate as high as you can, get the best kind of consulting job you can get your hands on, and then 24 months in, you think, shit, what can I do here? I need to be the first person in the company or the 51st person in the company, but there's not much space in there for a consultant. So when other people ask me, what was the experience like for you? Do you recommend it? I have a very similar answer to you, which I think is, I certainly don't regret my time in consulting. I can certainly write a good spreadsheet. The analytical skills are there. But if you were going to speak to someone at 16 now, would you, one, recommend going through that consulting period first? And if not, I guess where else would you look to direct people in a way that they could kind of be productive in the growth landscape when they're ready to make the jump?
Yeah, I think it really depends on. Again, everything's just highly contextual. So I think it would depend on their starting point and where they want to get to. I think if you're wanting to go and build tech companies, which is the context that I exist in, then there's, as I said, there's so many different ways to get there. I think one thing I did learn early on in my career that I think was great was we're not about our weaknesses, we're about our strengths. So the place I worked first, again, McKinsey, there was some quite, I think they're really thoughtful on L&D. And one of the things they said was actually most places focus on your weaknesses and say, how do we bring these up? We believe that if you do that, we just end up with someone who's kind of average all over. So our focus is to take what's the thing that makes you exceptional? And let's really build on that and give you a spike. And everything else we need to get to hygiene level, but let's take that special talent and really nurture that and push that. And I think that would be my biggest push to people is think about what you're doing there. Are you trying to round out your skill set to be a generalist, or are you trying to bring up some skills to a hygiene level, which makes sense, or are you trying to kind of nail your spike and really develop a specific and nurture a specific talent? And then once you've thought about that, maybe consulting is a great place to go. If you want to develop, a really strong analytical skill set, that's an amazing place to go. If you want to get a really fantastic work ethic, that's a great place to go. If you want to become a real kind of customer-centric or product-centric individual, that's not such a great place to go, and there are other places that I recommend. If you want to build companies, probably the best place to go at some point is into a company and see what it takes. Something I only realized later about how naive we were. When we built Gocardless, all three of us, all we'd ever done is we'd been at uni and worked in consultancies. We didn't even know what a tech startup looked like. We were kind of making it up in our minds of what we thought they looked like. And unsurprisingly, kind of wasn't a very accurate picture. And therefore, there's a load of stuff we got wrong along the way. So I think the context would be king. The second thing would be, okay, what's your spike? What's your special talent you want to develop? Where's the right place to do that? And then third, what's your end point? If you want to go and build companies, there are certain things you should do. If you want to go and kind of be a real specialist in an area, there are certain places you should go and do.
We're going to do two more questions. So before we go to the one at the back there's one remote one, which I'll just read out, which was from Vincenz, I think. Basically, as a company scales, how do you maintain the glue between people?
Yeah, it just gets harder and harder, and I think you have to start really early. And it's kind of similar to the last point. You have to know what makes you special as a company, and have these values. Trying to retrofit values onto a company 5 years in is almost impossible, because you come up with 5 values, and you're lucky if the average person kind of believes in 2 of them. So I think it's a daily exercise that you have to start on day one and ideally never stop. And the day you stop, it becomes 10 times harder to get it back. But back to, it's those same things, strategy, it's your overall strategy, your vision, your mission, and then your values and the culture that it creates. You have to invest in those things every day, and also recognize that they change. So our values have kind of morphed over the years at Nested and changed with where we are in the company and the stage. And I think that's really important. But the day you take your eyes off them, it just becomes really, really hard to bring those things back. And I think that applies as much at the company level as at the team level.
Question at the back, I think.
Yeah, here. So Ross had a question about if you could predict innovation. Do you think regulation in a market has an impact on whether innovation would go forward or not? And how much impact?
That's another really good question. Yeah, definitely. It definitely does. I always find it interesting, regulations and taxes and friction. And if you think about anything that you want to do, let's apply a really simple formula, which is basically conversion equals perceived benefit or reward minus perceived cost, and regulation fits firmly into that cost bucket and makes it harder, and therefore it makes conversion lower. So typically it's going to mean that less things can come through the other side. However, the purpose of that regulation is typically to make those things that do come through more stable. So it also creates barriers to entry on the other side. So that means the prizes can be much bigger when you get out the other side. So I think it has lots of impacts, and it's not necessarily clear what the ultimate impact on innovation is, because sometimes being kind of stable gives you the ability to innovate. Sometimes it makes you lazy, and we see that with different companies. But it definitely makes a huge difference.
Last question, no pressure for whoever. Do we have a final question? I can't see all the way at the back. I think somebody's moving. No more questions. Okay, fantastic. Well, I'd like a massive thank you and a big round of applause for Matthew, everybody. That was awesome. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to stop for a coffee break now, and then we'll do...